Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this session upon recent Fair Work amendments with a particular focus upon the impact on the important PHN sector, which we continue to support. Um, we do have quite a few people that are joining us today, so I can see people are still joining us as we come online. If it's okay, we might just wait a couple of moments just to allow other people to join. You want to take the opportunity to start your lunch or grab a drink, by all means, and we'll probably just start in a minute to let everyone join. Okay, team. Well, we might get started. Still a few people joining us, but we'll catch them up if needed. And of course, there's an opportunity to reach out to me directly if any of those people miss out. So we'll join late. So thank you for joining us. I appreciate that everyone has lots on, and I appreciate in most states there's public holidays this week or coming up next week. So to take an hour out of your time, I appreciate it. Sometimes difficult. So thank you. Um, the purpose of today is we wanted to get across some of the recent amendments in the Fair Work Act as it relates, in my view, to the PHN experience. For those that don't know me, my name is Wes O'Donnell. I'm the head of workplace relations and enterprise solutions with Citation Group. I'm a solicitor by background. Please don't hold that against me. But through my role, I support probably around 25%, 30% of the PHN sector across the country. And I've been really privileged to have that level of involvement and awareness of the sector. Um, the idea of today, which will continue at regular intervals as appropriate when the topics enable it, is to share some learnings and some information which is more specific to the PHN sector. And in these sessions, we are extending an invitation to not only our valued clients, and we'll continue with more direct support and information sessions with our strategic clients. But we've also extended the invitation to the broader PHN network as part of our ongoing commitment to share knowledge and experience across the sector generally. In that sense, what we are looking to achieve is not necessarily a legal update for the purposes of a legal update. I think that the information concerning recent changes through the closing the loophole legislation and others has been particularly well communicated. So we're not necessarily going to go through a assessment of that legislation itself, but rather an overview, in my experience, of those legislative updates and how it translates into the PHN experience, or put more simply, where I'm still getting questions from the PHN sector. For those that are joining us who aren't a client of Citation HR, there are a number of divisions. I'm happy to discuss that with you offline, but effectively, we are a holistic consultancy organization which provides services and support across all facets of the people life cycle, ranging from HR consultancy, workplace legal services, ISO certification, work health safety, and of course, a technology HRIS platform. In terms of the presentation today, I'd like to spend a bit of time to discuss the closing the loopholes legislation. Again, not a broad or detailed overview, rather, of that legislation itself, but more four areas which I think are having ongoing impacts with PHNs and some areas where PHNs are, I guess, struggling or addressing those legislative updates and the respected work provisions as it relates to your ongoing obligation to implement lasting change to address the risk of those types of activities within the workplace. Now, I will leave time, hopefully at the end, depending upon how we go. We will be aiming for this session to conclude around the 45, 50-minute mark, including questions and answers. If you do have questions as we go through, please feel free to put it in the Q&A function. What I'll try to do as we go through is to address as many of those questions as I can. Where I can't, I'll address them at the end. But of course, I'll also put up the contact details for our telephone advisory service and my own personal number. So if anyone would like to reach out, noting that sometimes a personal experience is sometimes difficult to raise in a group setting, I'm very happy to have that discussion on a one-on-one basis. So in particular, we know that over the last 2-year period now, draft legislation has been introduced by the federal government with a view to closing some of the inequities, as they put it, within the employment regulations and legislation in Australia. We knew, broadly speaking, that upon the Labor Party forming government, that there would be wholesale changes to our industrial relations framework. And I actually personally think that the changes we've seen since the Labor Party has formed government has been some of the most significant legislative changes from an industrial relations perspective that I've seen in quite some time. The nature and effect of those changes have been rather broad and deep in the context of enabling employees to raise disputes and creating a far greater number of rights for individuals within the workplace. The nature of that legislation is also somewhat more fundamental, given that it creates obligations, direct obligations upon the employer to act. And in many respects, rather, that legislation is framed as a positive, definitive obligation. So the employer must do X, Y, and Z. Now, what this does is it creates a framework which creates potential penalty structures in the event that the employer fails to act in accordance with the strict requirements of the legislation, but also creates a pathway through which employees can now more readily escalate disputes in a formal level with either the regulator or the Fair Work Commission. Now, that's important. It's not only important because effectively we are starting already to see a greater number of disputes escalate up into the Fair Work Commission, but what I'm seeing is that employers generally aren't really taking the opportunity to revise and revisit their internal framework, practices, policies, and procedures, which will put them in a really good place to respond to any dispute if and when it may arise with the Fair Work Commission. Now, I'll step through that. But a good example that I can provide in this sense is with the changes which were implemented with regards to the stop bullying jurisdiction. Now, I know it's somewhat different, but when the stop bullying jurisdiction commenced, effectively it enabled employees to raise and escalate disputes with the Fair Work Commission directly. And what we saw when that happened was that the Fair Work Commission was ready and very comfortable in pushing back control of that particular dispute at a workplace level, where they felt a degree of comfort that the policy structure and internal processes enabled that matter to be dealt with effectively at a local level. Conversely, where the Fair Work Commission didn't have that degree of comfort, it imposed a far stricter regime of review and control, which then brought the matter outside the control of the employer. And I think a similar experience would be had in these recent amendments, such as the right to disconnect and casual conversion and others, in the sense that where we create a robust contractual and policy framework, including internal review mechanisms, in the event that there's any external dispute escalated to the Fair Work Commission or others, I have a degree of comfort that we'll be able to wrestle that matter back and to deal with it in the context of an internal dispute or internal process. So that being said, most recently, we've seen the introduction of the right to disconnect. And lots of businesses are struggling with this to a certain extent, believing that it makes it unlawful for an employer to contact an employee outside of ordinary business hours or as outside of their ordinary pattern of work, to be more accurate. I have to say, though, that that's not what the legislation contains or the conduct which the legislation is intended to restrict. And that is the framework which is operating in some countries, particularly France, but it hasn't been adopted in Australia. What it does is it creates a right on the part of an employee, and note that it's framed as a right, to refuse to monitor, engage, read, or respond to any contact outside of business hours or outside their regular pattern of work, but only to the extent that that refusal is reasonable. Yeah. So there's a right to disconnect, and an employee may assert their right, but only to the extent that that right is reasonable. But what is considered reasonable turns on a multitude of factors, including the reason why an employee wishes to disconnect from the out of hours communication, the level of disruption, so whether it's frequent, whether it's one-off, whether it's ongoing, etc. Whether the individual is compensated as part of their ordinary remuneration package, the seniority of the role, the personal responsibilities and care factors associated with that individual, and any other factor which may be relevant to the consideration. Now, a couple of things with this. The government has introduced this right to disconnect in the Act, meaning it applies to all employees, regardless of whether they're covered by an enterprise agreement or modern award. It's also introduced into all modern awards, including the Health Professionals and Support Services Award from the 26th of August, meaning that there is a right enshrined within the award, which enables employees to then escalate disputes into the Fair Work Commission in the event that there's any dispute in relation to the connection. Okay? What we are seeing, however, particularly with a number of PHNs which are currently going through an enterprise bargaining process, is that unions are seeking to expand the parameters of that right to disconnect framework, seeking to broaden the limitations and restrictions and enhance the rights of employees even further. Now, that's important to note, particularly those that are going through bargaining or will be going through bargaining shortly, in the sense that this is a claim which many unions are advancing, and there's no obligation upon you to accept that, and care should be taken in accepting any of those types of claims. Otherwise, it will lock you into a framework, not only in the term of the enterprise agreement, but all subsequent agreements, because it's going to be very difficult to pull back. I also think that with this, there comes a level of awareness in terms of the dispute framework that an employee can raise. And as I mentioned, there is obviously internal workplace discussions, but there's now a formal dispute pathway into the Fair Work Commission, where an employee who has asserted a right or disputes the response by the employer can make an application with the Fair Work Commission. Now, as I mentioned before, I think that once we start seeing a greater number of these applications, we'll have a better understanding of how the Fair Work Commission will approach it. I think that they will take a very liberal approach in terms of the rights of an employee to impose the gap between the workplace and their personal life. And therefore, I think that organizations really need to take the time to do a couple of things. Firstly, we need to assess those individuals which may reasonably be called upon or expected to engage in work activities out of hours. In those individuals and in those circumstances, I would be strongly recommending that there's an updated contract of employment which reflects that expectation given the seniority of the individual, but also that the compensation paid to that individual incorporates adequate compensation for that inconvenience or disutility. There should also be corresponding guidance within a policy framework, both in relation to how there is a first instance requirement for an employee to escalate any concerns, and the process that the organisation will adopt in addressing those types of matters. Now, this is particularly important because where a escalation is disputed before the Commission, it will enable us to kind of localise the dealing with that matter without further engagement of the Fair Work Commission. We do also, I think, need to take steps to educate our people in relation to what type of engagement needs to be responded to and the actions of management in communicating with people out of hours. I personally, as an example, have taken steps to ensure in any communication with my own team out of hours that I note that this communication is simply sent out of hours given it's the nature of when I perform work, but there's no expectation upon my team members to engage or respond outside of ordinary business hours. I've also communicated a general practice with my own team around in the event that there is infrequent and ad hoc occasions where out of hours communication is necessary, I will communicate with them in a different method at first instance to make them aware of the importance and urgent nature of the communication I sent through. And typically I do that by SMS to say that there is an urgent message that I sent through. If you're able to, I'd appreciate your immediate attention. And that significantly limits the volume of communication which employees are needing to review, consider, and respond outside of hours. Another update is in relation to the casual conversion and employment provisions. Now, I appreciate that casual employment has not necessarily been all that prevalent within the PHN sector. I have started to see it, however, in increasing frequency given the restrictions upon the use of fixed and maximum term contracts as a valid engagement structure. So I've included this simply because I think the prevalence of casual employment in the sector will increase over time. We have seen in the context of casual as well as contractors, which I'll get to in a minute, a revision in the definition of those particular engagement models. Previously, the definition of casual employment was a casual employee was an individual defined as such, and therefore there was a heavy reliance upon the wording of the relationship within the engagement documents. But now the nature of the relationship turns on all of the circumstances. So there is effectively this more broad definition, and for anyone utilizing older version contracts, I'd suggest that you update your casual contract to reflect the current terminology. There's also been a significant update in relation to the casual conversion provisions, predominantly because the government has identified that there has not been a significant pathway to permanency. So now employees, casual employees who have been engaged in their opinion on a regular and systematic basis after a 6-month period can simply issue correspondence or notification to the employer that they no longer consider themselves to be a casual given the ongoing engagement in the organisation, and they consider themselves in effect to be a permanent employee. Now, that places the obligation upon the employer to respond in the negative as opposed to going through a consideration process. Now, I don't expect that there'll be a significant volume of people taking that pathway, but still it's something that we need to be conscious of. There's also a significant amendment to the frequency upon which we need to provide casual employees with a copy of the casual information statement. Casual information statements need to be provided as soon as reasonably practicable upon the commencement of employment. And in the context of a large employer, which is all of you on today's session, there is a further requirement to provide another copy of the casual employment information statement after 6 months of service, after 12 months of service, and every 12 months thereafter. So just to go through that again, casual employment information statement as soon as reasonably practicable after the commencement of employment, so not in the information package before commencement or with the job offer, but after the commencement of employment, after 6 months, after 12 months, and then every 12 months thereafter. Now, we should take note that this is expressed as an absolute requirement, meaning that whilst it's an inconvenience, it is expressed as an absolute obligation, and penalties may technically flow in the event that an employer fails or refuses to follow that cadence of communication out. We have seen that there are some systems and processes lacking, if I can put it that way, within some organizations that we support, not necessarily the PHN sector, where there is an absence of processes around that cadence. So we really need to make sure that our systems are in place through whatever people management platform software you use to ensure that we're capturing when that occurs. The other thing which I wanted to step through is in relation to the use of independent contractors. Now, this is something which effectively is relatively prevalent within the PHN space. And what we've seen recently is a revision back to an historical definition of independent contractors. Yeah. I've received so many calls this year where the individual is expressing a view that, or read in the media, that you can no longer engage independent contractors, and that's just simply not the case. I've also seen some advisors, particularly in the PHN sector, saying that they can no longer engage casuals given the nature of independent contractors, sorry, given the nature of the work performed, and that it creates a heightened risk to their organization, which is unacceptable. And I don't agree with that either, if I'm completely honest. I think that independent contractors as an engagement method continues and will continue to be a very valuable and appropriate engagement structure, particularly within the PHN space. What has happened, though, is the definition of what is considered to be an independent contractor has now reverted back to the original position. So if I can explain it simply, there has been a very famous case, Stevens and Brodrib, which effectively determined that an independent contractor is viewed as someone which, upon all of the circumstances, is determined to be truly independent and providing services to an organization rather than being under a contract of service. That decision was somewhat reverted in the JAMSEC decision approximately 2 years ago of the High Court, which determined that, in effect, the nature of a relationship shouldn't be determined by the courts, and the courts really should not have any part in imposing their view as to what the nature of a relationship should be, and that if two parties bargained the nature of the relationship, which is reflected in a contract, that should have precedence. And that was a great decision which many employers latched onto, and contracts were changed and things on that nature. But the government has formed the view that there is often a power imbalance upon the creation of an independent contractor relationship in many sectors, not all, not yours, but in many sectors, particularly contract cleaning and things like that. And to rely upon a contractual definition where one party may not have the means to bargain a variation to the contract may lead to a degree of abuse. And in essence, what's happened is that the definition of an independent contractor is now reverted back to the previous definition, which is what we call a multi-indicia test. And that is the courts will be required to look at all the circumstances, including the contract, but all of the circumstances will need to be considered when determining the proper nature of it. Now, what that means, in my view, is that there is a real need to go back to the contract yet again, sorry for this, to really ensure that the contract is tight with regards to a couple of things. One, the definition of the relationship, but two, particular indemnities within that contract, which states that the contractor indemnifies the engager, the PHN, in the event that they pursue a claim that the relationship is anything other than an independent contractor arrangement. And this is a really important provision because what it effectively does is it seeks an acknowledgement from the parties of the true nature of the relationship at the start. Now, it's not indicative, it's one factor to be determined, but it kind of significantly reduces the value of an individual arguing or disputing the nature of the relationship, which limits the circumstances upon which that will be challenged. Yeah. So again, you can start to see that some of these changes are really warranting a structural update to the policy and contractual relationships between the parties. And if you haven't viewed those contractual relationships with your independent contractors, I'd be strongly suggesting that you do so and look at it from a procurement perspective as well, because in many circumstances with the businesses that we support, there is often a disconnect between HR, who may support with the onboarding and recruitment of direct employees, whereas an ops or procurement team may be engaged with the onboarding or engagement of independent contractors who may not necessarily be as across the legislative requirements as HR, senior management, exec level individuals, as an example. I also think within the PHN space as well, it's not a particular statutory requirement as yet, but I do anticipate that things will change in the not too distant future, given the government's focus on what we call downstream compliance. And we are seeing that the federal government are imposing expectations upon individuals, organisations which receive federal funds. And there's an expectation, as we all know, that those organisations are fit and proper purpose organisations to receive those funds. And we're seeing that in the context as an example of an expectation around PHNs to obtain ISO certification as an example. In some areas within the federal government funding conditions, there's an expectation that those organisations who then on-forward some of those government funds ensure downstream compliance. And, it's just something to bear in mind as part of your commissioning and tender processes around those organisations which are in receipt of funds from you, around how are they structured? Are they best practice from a people management and compliance perspective? And how do you test that? Because we are, I think, going to start seeing as a next phase an expectation of what we call that downstream compliance review. I'll skip over this to a large extent, if I may. I know that there is very limited circumstances in which this will have any direct implication within the PHN structure itself. However, there are limited circumstances I'm aware of, so I will raise it for completion. But in effect, there is the ability under the recent changes for individuals or organisations such as unions on their behalf to seek what's called a regulated labour hire arrangement order. And what this seeks to do is to close out loopholes where a on-hire worker or contractor is placed with a host and the host utilizes an enterprise agreement and the on-hire worker is paid a rate of pay less than what is contemplated within the enterprise agreement. We are seeing this quite frequently at the moment through storage and wholesale services as an example, but I am aware that there are a number of PHNs which utilize an enterprise agreement and engage contract labor in some respects, so I raise it for completion. Now, what that means is that where they are engaged for 3 months or more, because there is an exception for short-term placements of 3 months or less. So where we're engaging on hire labor, either as a on hire worker or contractor for 3 months or more, and you utilize an enterprise agreement, and that enterprise agreement covers the duties which would otherwise be performed by that on-hire worker, then we must ensure that effectively the rates of pay, terms and conditions extended to that on-hire worker are no less favorable than those contained within your enterprise agreement. Yep. So again, I won't spend a lot of time on it. I anticipate that effectively it will arise in very limited circumstances, but I do know that there are a reasonable proportion of the PHN sector which utilize enterprise agreements, and I am starting to see longer term contracts on hire contract arrangements in the clients that we support. So I just raise it for completion. The other thing I will raise very quickly is the increase in relation to penalties and review structures around wage theft, and in particular, the criminalisation of wage theft and significant penalties associated with the underpayment of wages. Now, this has taken a great deal of, or obtained rather, a great deal of media coverage. I think that there are limited circumstances where this will apply into the PHN sector, but I will raise it for completion because we are seeing audit and risk committees of boards picking this up and undertaking or requiring a detailed review. But effectively, the wage theft provision relates to where there is a intention to engage in conduct of underpaying employees their statutory entitlements. That's an intention, a knowing and deliberate act, which effectively is seeking to underpay an individual, and imprisonment up to 10 years can result. Now, bear in mind that the burden of proof is on the Department of Prosecutions to establish beyond all reasonable doubt that there was an intention to underpay an individual. Yeah, that's important. And that's going to be pretty hard to prove. But having said that, there is corresponding increases in what we call civil remedy provisions concerning the underpayment of wages, where anyone who is knowingly involved in a underpayment of wages or a civil remedy provision can now experience significant fines and penalties. And that's a lesser category. So that doesn't involve a willful or deliberate attempt to underpay, but is where any individual is knowingly concerned through willful ignorance as well in the underpayment of wages, and significant penalties flow both to the individual and organisation proper. Through those provisions, we are seeing greater powers of the Fair Work Ombudsman to investigate, but we're also seeing from the 1st of January of next year a broadened scope of power with the Fair Work Commission to deal with small underpayment of wages claims. So just a bit of a heads up that this is coming down the pipe. We are seeing in many PHNs and organisations that it is a focus of an audit and risk committee. We are therefore seeing that there is a structured approach needing to be undertaken to undertake an audit of systems, practices, processes to ensure compliance. Now, you may say that this has limited bearing upon PHNs who broadly engage people on a salary basis. However, I'd be recommending that one of the areas that you need to review, which not many organisations do well, is an assessment of salary conditions to ensure that the hours actually worked translates to a rate of pay which is at least equivalent to the modern award or NES provisions. Now, don't want to get into that too much. I'm happy to discuss it offline, but that's specifically the issue which has been raised and identified within Woolworths, and their underpayment claim is currently up around the $500 million mark. So that particular issue is very much on the radar of the Fair Work Ombudsman and a particular area of focus. I'm very happy also to discuss systems and review processes to meet that kind of audit threshold and requirement, if anyone would be interested in doing that. In the interest of time, I will skip through the workplace delegate rights, but very happy to address any questions if necessary. And just wanted to, and the slides will be made available to everyone today. So please excuse me if you think that I'm skipping through, but to a broad extent, I've touched upon most of the content, or where I haven't, I think the content within the slides will be sufficient when we email those out or available upon request. The other thing which I wanted to touch upon as another direct and positive duty where I am seeing some ongoing struggles somewhat is in relation to the positive duties to eliminate sexual discrimination and harassment in the workplace. Now, we're all familiar that this has been introduced some time ago, both in relation to the Fair Work Act as well as the Sex Discrimination Act, but in essence, it places a direct duty upon employees to take all positive steps to avoid sexual harassment to the extent that is reasonably practicable. Now, two things which I'm seeing, particularly in the PHN space, which isn't necessarily compliant, is one, undertaking effective training and refresher courses. And I can touch upon that with any individual who may be interested, but there needs to be an entire life cycle approach taken to this. So, setting expectations through the recruitment process, communicating expectations and value through the onboarding process, having robust contracts of employment, implementing comprehensive training, then ongoing refresher courses throughout an individual's employment. Now, strongly suggest e-learning, etc. For those clients that are on the call. Those are already in existence within your Citation HR cloud portal, free of charge. It's available to all of you there to deploy en masse or on an individual basis. The second element that I see with this that isn't necessarily compliant with a PHN's obligation is the obligation to extend that consideration into PCBUs or other PCBUs. Now, I assume many of you are across your WHS obligations, but in short, I'll raise it. Under WHS legislation, there is an obligation upon a person conducting a business or undertaking. That's a different definition of you as an organization or any organization conducting a business to undertake a process of due diligence to identify risk and to implement control measures to mitigate, avoid, or remove that risk to the extent that's reasonably practicable. That duty extends, in effect, to consulting with other PCBUs, and as such, there is a dual obligation in many respects. And within the PHN structure, we know that there is often employees in other places of work, clinics, practices, organizations, etc. And the obligation extends into undertaking some form of cooperative effort with those other PCBUs around what you can do to control and improve the conduct and experience in those workplaces. Now, the reason why this is becoming a bit of an issue is that it's a common area of fault. And we are seeing, particularly in Victoria, I might say, Safe Work undertaking audits around the compliance with this particular positive duty. And they're also seeming to focus upon the recorded steps undertaken by a PCBU to engage in other PCBUs in relation to this duty, both in regards to the potential physical workplace, but also the likelihood of an individual experiencing a psychological risk of injury in those workplaces. And we know, of course, that individuals experiencing sexual harassment, there is a very close link between that experience and psychological injury. So in terms of that flow, I'd just like to suggest that we, as I mentioned, undertake a whole of life cycle approach of identifying risks, reporting those risks as soon as we can, creating that reporting culture, and also having very clear positive obligations and expectations which are communicated throughout the employee lifecycle, both through the recruitment process, onboarding, and of course, throughout the entire employment journey. So that being said, we might just quickly turn to any questions, and there's quite a few of them have come through. I will try to address as many of them as I can. We were hoping to bring this session to a close at around 1:45, but I might just go over slightly. And of course, for those of you who are clients, feel free to call through to the telephone advisory service. The number's on the screen, 0290830000. And of course, that telephone advisory number is available on a 24/7 basis. Alternatively, if there is a matter of significance, or if you're not yet a client of Citation HR and you'd like to raise a specific experience with me directly, of course, you're all free and invited to call through to me individually, and my mobile number is available on the screen as well. So a couple of questions, if I could. My colleague Ash has been kindly filtering a number of these questions, some of which seem a little bit unique and personal. So if I, again, miss over your question, I apologize, but in the interest of time and perhaps given the personal nature of the question, I invite you to call through to me directly, or alternatively the telephone advisory service if you're a client. Very happy to support. First question is, can you tell me more about the new independent contractor legislation and how it impacts upon our ability to engage on a fixed term basis? Yeah, really good question. The independent contractor legislation, again, doesn't prevent or limit the engagement of independent contractors. I think it's still a very valid engagement model. Yeah, it just flips back in terms of the definition. My own personal experience within the PHN space, what I've seen happen as a result of the limitation around fixed term contracts is that most organizations have taken the opportunity to review their organizational structure and bring those individuals in as direct ongoing employees, which is fantastic. Great. We're also undertaking quite a few processes with PHNs to undertake a review and restructure and right sizing at the same time to align skill sets with future strategic objectives. So that's an interesting outcome as well. But that being said, we are seeing in certain circumstances one of two things as well. Where someone may have been engaged on a fixed term contract basis, we're seeing that they're pushing them into either a independent contractor structure or on some limited occasions, a casual employment model. Thinking that those models are safer and better than bringing them in as a direct employee, predominantly, I assume, because of the restrictions around the ability to pay redundancy compensation. A couple of things I'll say with that. I don't necessarily mind the engagement of independent contractors per se. Need to make sure that the contract is really fit for purpose, updated and relevant. We do need to make sure, however, that we are taking care with regards to what we call sham contracting arrangements. Yeah, so there is that ability there. The other thing which I think we need to be conscious of is the engagement of individuals on a casual basis. I don't mind casual engagements. I think it's sensible that some people have explored it. The issue that I'm kind of seeing there is, however, that there's this false sense of security that a casual engagement model doesn't necessarily give rise to risk when, in fact, a casual employee still has access, or should I say casual employee engaged on a regular and systematic basis still has access to unfair dismissals and other things. So just I'd hazard a caution there. Just where we were previously engaging people on a fixed term basis, I just think that you need to really understand the nature of the engagement, the purpose of that particular engagement, and then assess whether it's direct employment, whether it's on a fixed or maximum term, but within the restrictions of the current legislation, or whether we push them into a proper independent contractor engagement model or a casual employment model. But really good question. Question about our e-learning modules within the platform. Do you feel that the Respect at Work e-learning modules can be we can access in the citation platform as suitable to assign annually? We rolled it out last time, but they're due to provide training again. Really good question. Thank you. No, I don't think that they're relevant, if I'm honest, to roll them out annually. The reason why I say that is that those modules have been designed to effectively bring people up to a level of knowledge which is consistent with your obligations. So there are 7 modules, and fantastic that you rolled them out. I'm really, really great and pleased to hear that. I can announce that we're in the process of finalizing a refresher module, which we will do frequently. So in that respect, we should be announcing, hopefully before Christmas, possibly early in the new year, a release of new e-learning content in a number of areas. Hopefully, well, definitely in relation to a refresher course around the Respect at Work provisions. We also anticipate that there will be additional WHS modules, particularly in the context of psychosocial risk within an organization as well. So fantastic that you've launched them. I'd probably suggest if you could bear with us a little bit just to get that refresher course updated. I think that would probably be more relevant to your organization, and watch out for that notification and alerts from our marketing team. As soon as we have that schedule updated for you, we'll communicate as to when those modules are live. Okay. I might say as well, thank you for that. In particular, if you have any ideas for topics or e-learning modules which would resonate with your own experience, we are very happy to receive them. Now, we're never going to be a LMS platform because we're focused on modules which address your compliance obligation. But to the extent that you have some ideas, feel free to push them through. We're very happy to put them on our development roadmap. Okay. If I could, just one last question. Is right to disconnect an automatic entitlement for employees to not communicate with their employers? Yes and no. I think that the way in which the question might have been framed is a little bit wrong with respect. It's a right which exists within all employers which are large employers. So that right commenced on the 26th of August of this year for any business which has 15 or more employees. For small businesses, just as a matter of course, that's delayed by a year. So for small businesses with 14 or fewer employees, then that right comes into play on the 26th of August next year. So that right for all of your employees exists now. Yeah. And an employee can assert that right at any time moving forward. But remember, it's not an entitlement to not respond or communicate, but rather it's a ability to assert a right, but only where that right is reasonable. And as such, an employer can have open, transparent, respectful conversations around an individual's refusal, and whether that's consistent with the expectations of the role, the compensation paid, etc. Now, the ability to have that open, transparent, and respectful conversation will broadly be dictated by policy, procedures, and others, which is, again, another reason why we would suggest you review your contractual framework and policies. But if anyone is having experience with individuals within the workplace asserting this right or expressing it in an incorrect or incomplete fashion within the workplace, I'd be very happy to discuss that with you directly, because we do need to be conscious because it's expressed as a right. So if we get it wrong or impose a detriment as a result of the employee exercising that right, well, then it creates a clear pathway and a very, very obvious general protections exposure and risk as well. Okay. There are a number of questions. I'm sorry, I've already gone 5 minutes over, so I won't address any more if that's okay. I really sincerely appreciate the number of people which have taken time out of your busy diary to attend today's session. Given how well this has been attended, we will look to schedule these in future but only where I think there is topics of substance to communicate. Of course, if we can help any of you further, both clients and non-clients, we'd like to think that we have a commitment to share and support the PHN sector generally. Please feel free to reach out to me personally, or for those who are valued clients, please feel free to reach out directly to the telephone advisory service. And have a great day. And I hope the Swannies win on the weekend. Talk to you soon. Bye.